Because, guys, we're up to 7,000 subscribers.
7,600.
Oh.
I calculated if we stay at our current rate of growth, we should hit 10,000 subscribers in 10 months. Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of your favorite podcast, Unresolved Textual Tension. It's me, your host, Maria, and my ruggedly handsome co-host, William.
Hey guys, what's up? I'm super rugged today. I'm super handsome, as you can tell by my hair. Both things are valid. Today, what book are we doing, Maria?
We are doing Ninefox Gambit by
Yoon Ha Lee.
Yoon Ha Lee. I knew it was Yoon. I've just forgot the first, but Yoon Ha Lee, which has gotten nominated a couple of times for our Patreon book club live stream, which this is. It finally won.
Yeah, I had seen it on the list a couple times. I put it on. I think this was the second time I had put it as one of the 3 nominations because I really like esoteric, magic-y space stuff. I really like that vibe. It's one of the reasons I'm such a Warhammer fan, I think. And this seemed like, ooh, smart sci-fi. And we're going to see how well that pans out. And opinions were very divided on our Patreon as to the effectiveness of this book, which I think is apparently how most people find this book. Either they really love it or they really hate it. I am closer to one polarity than the other. Maria.
Guess which one that is.
It's annoying because some of our patrons liked it, so I have to be more diplomatic than I would be for like 1,000,000 to 1 or like any of the other books we've read.
I don't think it's as bad as 1,000,000.
No. It's no. No.
But we didn't have to be diplomatic. Number one, 1,000,000 to 1, nobody liked. Like we couldn't even
exactly.
Find, and it was unknown. We could just be brutal as heck. As far as where I land, I definitely, so the polarities are people who really loved it but acknowledged some of the like things that don't work. Like we had a couple of people who really enjoyed it but found some structural issues in it, or who enjoyed it and acknowledged some of the critiques the others made but loved it anyway. And then we had the people who were like, no, I don't like. And then a couple of people in the middle where they liked certain things but really disliked other things. I would say I'm kind of between middle and dislike. Like I'm definitely not on the heavy like side of things because of who I am as a reader. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I like a little slow luxuriating. I like some beautiful character developments that are slow. I like a little piecemeal surprises. This book hurt me. It hurt my brain. Sometimes I was describing it last night to some friends who were over because I still had about 3 hours to get to when they were leaving, that I felt like I was wading through some word soup at a couple of points. And there, in the later half of the book, it does this thing where it starts introducing little cutscenes with other characters who are not the main characters you have gotten associated to. And there was a couple times where I was like, are these good guys or bad guys? If they die, do I go yay, or do I go, oh no, that's no good? And it was only by going back, I reread so much of this book. That's part of the reason why it took me so long to finish it. I just reread entire chunks. I finished it this morning and then reread the first hour of it in preparation for this because, this book.
Some people say that this book is not holding your hand and that it is complex, and that's good because it helps you learn. I don't think so. I think this book is vague, and it's interesting because hearing people say that it was well built out or it's not holding your hand has made me specify my arguments a lot more than I normally would. That's one of the things about going into this has happened with the book club, like with Sabriel, except in Sabriel's case, I was like, these are the reasons on a granular level it's good. This has forced me to think about like exactly why I think it's vague and not well set up in very specific terms. Also, Jadao said, who very much loved this book, it's okay. It's pistolas. No. It's math pistolas.
It's math pistolas. It's calendrical warfare pistolas.
And we have no idea what the pistolas can do. They can do anything. It's never
We have
defined.
no idea. And there's multiple types of pistolas. The only thing I know is that there are fungus bombs and that
Amputation rays.
I'm not exactly sure what the fungus bomb did, except that it like took out some people. There was a kaleidoscope bomb that made ghosty ships. There was the carry-on gun or bomb that turned people into icicles of memory. Anyway, so I'm gonna highlight some comments just because some people have been saying some stuff. So Angry Otter said, I don't think anyone I don't think anyone really hated in the Discord, which is true. I wouldn't say anyone is super.
I'm in the Discord.
Never mind. Will. Miss Ali Soto said, I didn't hate it. Solid 2.5. Angry Otter said, I don't really think anybody hated it in the Discord, followed up by, unless they were just being nice. Lindbergh, it's hard to say this book is bad. It might just not be everyone's tastes. Maria swimming in word soup. Oh god, it was so much word soup, guys.
Yeah, Saga said that word soup is a good description, and I think so as well.
Aaron says, I really don't know what the second half of the book is about. Lindbergh says, I was waiting for Karis to introduce herself all through the book, and then it ended, TBH. I feel like all the death is bad? Bad? Yes, that one.
As I said, I vibed with the book, but had zero clue what was happening. Yeah, I mean, I think you can vibe with this book, but I'm going to be making the argument throughout that all of the parts of this book that are for a specific kind of reader that resonated with people could be better. I don't think this is the best version of this book for this audience, even. I think some of my vehemence may come from, I've talked before about how contrary I am. And, you know, I don't go hard on Ice Planet Barbarians because nobody thinks Ice Planet Barbarians is good. Whereas a book that people do think is good, and you can tell the book thinks it's good, I tend to have a more visceral reaction to. Again, I tend to have more visceral reactions to mediocre books as well. And so I think there's an extent to which I don't think I'm being hard or unfair on the book, but I think I would be a little bit nicer to it if I didn't think that people thought it was so smart. And so, you know, just temper my commentary throughout this the podcast with that understanding. But why don't you tell us what the premise is before we start talking about more of our general impressions? Because this book is weirdly complicated. And
yet for the first third, very little happened. And then the last third, I don't know. Okay. Anyway, welcome to sci-fi. This is a sci-fi book, guys, in case you didn't know, which means it's probably not going to do well for the channel. Yay!
So this book actually is so hard to describe because the synopsis on Goodreads is nearly unintelligible, and we were told that going in. And looking back, that was a good way of weeding out people who maybe would not have been interested in this book. But Rick Riordan, who wrote the Percy Jackson books or whatever, is the first review on Goodreads and has a better synopsis that actually makes it sound interesting, which is that this is like a space empire, and they basically have math magic. They have a calendar, and because everybody believes in the calendar, it can have like exotic effects. So you can have like laser swords, or like, again, a plague that rots through people, or just a field where everybody loses their limbs.
Basically, it's any kind of weird, because there's a bunch of weird magic. Like there's a kaleidoscope cannon or a bomb that makes ships look like multiple ships, but they can also kind of hurt you, even though there was only 4 ships to begin with. And all of that kind of stuff is fueled by the calendar that they have. The calendar is fueled by belief, by ritual days where people have to get tortured, though you're not told this at the beginning. It is a hexarch. So it has 6 factions, like 6. This is basically an empire ruled by personality types. Like, depending on what you're good at, you get funneled into one of these little places. Though you can choose. It's not like what was that dumb?
Divergent.
Yeah, it's not like Divergent, where like you get put in by you get to choose. And one of my issues, and I'm just going to mention this now, is it took me forever to figure out what all the factions were. There are so many names. I had to literally this morning look up what all the factions were and what they did, because 78, nearly 80% through the book, I still didn't know. And I don't want to say, guys, that I'm like decent at following complex
Maria
plots.
is not me, guys. She actually remembers stuff pretty well.
I'd like to say that if anybody watched Grace of Kings and went, wow, she managed to memorize a lot, it's because I fucking pay attention.
No, by the end, I was like, okay, I've sat through this book. There are the Kel, who are the military guys. There are the Kuos, who are like the bisexual ninja assassins, who are like the cool people. And then there's like some nerds who are good at math.
The Narai.
Okay. And then I think there are some like administrator people.
There's the Ongan, who I think are the I think the Ongan are the the Didonan are the educator people, and they also do re-education. And then there's the Ongan, which I think are the oh god, there are the Ragall. Completely forgot those guys. What did the Ongan do? Were they cultural? Were they the cultural guys? Because I remember what's his face saying that they were really pretty.
So here's the thing. This is the first place that I think the book is unnecessarily complicated in terms of like he does not. The other okay. So we have to talk that this book info dumps a lot. Like the first third of this book is like very little happens because it's just explaining things to you, and yet we have no idea about the basics of their society in a lot of ways. Again, if there's 7 or 6 factions, like we barely remember any by the end of the book. There's no reason that you shouldn't, by a third of the way through the book, know what these are. Like there just isn't. I think partly it's the random names where it's like, okay, well, that's harder to remember than like the military or whatever. But
a couple of people noted this as a preference, but the problem is there's no point where the book explains what they are, or they do like they'll say something like, oh, you know, the Ondens love their fashion, and then you're like, oh, maybe their culture, and then they talk about the Narai being book nerds, and you're like, maybe those are the tech guys. But like some of the other ones, like the Didona, the
Loza, who got canceled, Celia says, which is so funny.
They were the 7th, but they like 100 years ago
got canceled.
Anyway, so these 6 factions each has their own like ultimate guy who is in charge. I forgot the name of that. But it's like there's one person who is like, oh, I'm in charge. And and I learned this because of the article I read, but there's the high factions and the low factions. I didn't pick that up at all through reading.
I think it's about the low factions are poised to stop the high factions, or at least like their banners were. I think so. Here's the thing about world building. So I've often talked about how in prose you don't want abstracted prose, right? So instead of saying she looked happy, you say she smiled, because one of those is a concrete expression that someone does that you can have in your mind, or even like a light shined through her smile or something like that would give you an idea of what something looks like. The problem with I knocked out my earphone. I felt so strongly about this, guys. The problem with the world building in this book is, and some people have said they vibed with it, which is, yes, it's just a vibe though. Like you get the idea of like, oh, it's abstracted. There are these different factions, but because you don't really understand what they are or what they do, or even what they're like, then you're just like, okay, there are factions, not there are these 4 factions. Or I'm trying to think of an example, but mostly I'm just coming up with a Song of Ice and Fire, which is okay, I think, because Katie isn't here. So Maria will just be having to drink a lot, and then we'll see how her bladder holds up by the end of the video. But like in that one, for example, it's very confusing at the beginning which great houses are which, but like the books actually explain it to you. So by the end of the first like third of the book, you understand all the important ones for that one. It's not an abstracted thing.
I'm gonna use a different book series, Hyperion.
Wait, hold on. Deteran said, wait, it's a math-based setting and they weren't called fractions. That's really funny.
In Hyperion, when I first started it, it's got a lot of vocabulary, like in that first intro chapter where you're like, what the fuck is any of this? And you're just like, and that happens to me a lot with a lot of high fantasy and a lot of hard sci-fi. It was funny, I was talking to my friend Gina about this, that you all know, Mistress Sapphire. Her and I are going to be reviewing a book in a few weeks together for your viewing pleasure, but we were talking about it. One of the things that we were talking about is how in like a lot of hard sci-fi, that's just how it is. They like, you get a lot of words and then eventually you get comfortable with it. And it happened with me with Mask of Mirrors as well, where like in the first third of the book, I was like, who am I? What are all of these words?
It's especially bad with technobabble, which this book has so much of.
And it doesn't explain a lot of it. I reread the first chapter, about the first hour of the book after I finished the entire book this morning to see if that first section made more sense. And it made some more sense, but there were still parts of it where I was like, whoa, that like you almost want to stop and replay a sentence or listen to it at a slower speed. I also want to highlight some comments we have. So Pearl, who is one of the people who really enjoyed it, I think this book starts to become trouble on the first read if you try to pay attention to everything, which I do.
Weird quality for a book. Celia then under that says...
But everyone argued that because the book doesn't hold your hand, you should pay attention to everything to understand the subtext.
That was also an argument that was made a lot.
And then Pearl says, I mean, yes, it does expect you to extrapolate what's important to pay attention to and what's not. And then Ali Snow says, the factions seemed unnecessarily complicated. In my opinion, the concept of factions in general is rarely done in a way that makes sociological sense. Lindbergh says, I've reread the first 3 chapters 3 times, and I notice more things, but I don't feel wiser. One of the things I noticed, which I'm going to mention in my recap, was that moment where she was like, and her secret heart turned away from the banner. And I was like, were you also secretly rebellious this whole time and we didn't like...
Well, and then also, it's a little unclear because they keep talking about how hearts make the calendrical system go. Let's describe the first 2 or 3 chapters with her, because then that'll explain some of the problems, because it does introduce a lot of the concepts. So our main character is Cheris, or Karis. I can't remember, even though I listened to an audiobook. Karis. And she is the command leader of like some infantry people, and they are on a planet that is in heresy against the calendrical system.
Ooh.
Which means that they don't follow the same calendar, and because of that, they can use different technology, and the technology of, is it called the Empire? What is it called?
The Hex Art.
Yeah, the Hex Art doesn't work there as well. And she's like, oh, this is a problem. And but we are Kel, which is the military faction, and we have like formations that work in the calendrical system but don't work in this heretical system. Immediately, you may be like, oh, that's very cool. Geometry. This is a math-based system, so geometry has certain strengths in it. That's cool. So they have to keep very specific formations. But here's a question that I never got an answer to. What happens when they run into a wall or a house? How do you keep formation in an urban environment?
But also, is the formations, do they physically have to be in formation? Is it just a math equation that goes over the group and then is connected to all of them? Like, there was a lot of questions I had about the logistics, which again, this book is not interested. Like, it is not like, ooh, let me show you. There's some sci-fi where they're like, I'm going to take you into explicit detail about all of the cool ideas I have. This book is not that, which for some people who don't actually want to know the minutia, they're going to enjoy. Some people don't want the minutia.
No. Look, I am a fan of space magic-y. This is, again, Warhammer. Warhammer has some ridiculous space magic systems. But the thing about it is that there is a kernel you can latch onto in terms of understanding the magic system at its core, and also the things it can do are limited. So, for example, one of the things that I think this book could have done is actually, like, okay, so the calendrical system, we only ever hear about that in the abstract. Again, this book's magic system is extremely abstract and world building. But maybe he could have gone like, okay, under a base 0 system, they have anti-grav powers. Where under a base 10 system, they can, like, they're heavier on gravity. Or, the way the Mayan calendar works, where it's actually 2 gears where you have the long count and the short count. Yeah, that's a Mayan one. Like, that would have been a very cool system if suddenly they could have like a duality. And that's one of the problems, is that they're fighting in this beginning part a heretical faction. We'll fight another one later. But the heretical faction just can do other unexplained economic or exotic effects. And it's never explained how these effects work or what they do. And again, so you have no limits and you have nothing to latch onto in terms of, like, maybe the calendrical system is changing the base paraxioms of physics. Like, that's a thing that's understood in physics, is that certain things just work because they work, and in another universe they might not, and it would be an entirely different thing. None of that is really done here.
Angriata brings up that they talk about adjusting formations to deal with variables in the moment, and how she has to literally assess the entire field and see what is happening to find the correct formation to deal with it. But we never find out, like, there's no moment where it's like, oh, because of this thing, this is reacting poorly, so we have to counteract it. Like, we get her being like, she was looking at the math, there was the discrepancy, she could now get the correct formation, and so everything is abstract. You're not actually getting the explanation behind it. It's like if you're watching someone, you know, like in Star Trek science, where they're like, beep, beep, boop, 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 boop. Yeah, this is the code to break the magic system. But there's no like, yes, that's what it felt like a little bit. The entire formation, calendrical math magic feels a little bit like Star Trek.
It feels a lot like technobabble, but worse in that the technobabble on, at least in Star Trek, they have technobabble. Though, I'm a Trekkie, I grew up with it, so just to very quickly, it's actually a problem that gets worse as the series goes on. The original series, I rewatched it, I don't know, a year or two ago, they never mention technobabble. Like, very, very rarely do they mention technobabble. In TNG, they start mentioning technobabble. But you can still see, like, okay, this emotional stakes are do we trust the engineer to know what they're doing, or have they self-actualized in this episode? And then in Voyager, it gets to be a problem where they're constantly talking about subspace, and I have no idea, and they've never explained it, and it becomes more abstract. In this one, it becomes very there's a difference between a system that you can tell the author understands but is not telling you everything about, and then one where the author just has not done the work. So I want to talk about two things. Perlet said, like, the way trying to understand in real life math gets very nebulous, and you just have to accept rules work till you get the equations to work. I think that was the vibe Yoon was going for. Or, excuse me, Yoon Ha Lee.
And then, which tells me something about what he thinks about math.
I mean, first of all, I am not a math fan. I literally understand math so little that to get through college, I had to tie abstract concepts to it, like the fact that, like, negatives cancel each other out. I was like, oh, the entropy of the universe. Like, I literally had to do that because I understand math so little. But again, there is an understanding of, like, he doesn't understand how this works. He doesn't know enough math to make a plausible, like, oh, you know, it's revving up the engine because it's similar to this concept in math. None of that is really happening. And then also, you can interrupt me, by the way, because I'm going to just keep talking, because there's also some stuff. Everyone had mentioned a lot of, okay, Judoshu said, I think of this as a soft magic. It wasn't going to answer those questions. I get the frustration, but I don't think it bothered me as much. I think it conveyed complexity and inaccessibility and order. So the problem is that soft magic systems are basically always tied to a certain amount of non-world building. So an example, Maria, take a shot. A Song of Ice and Fire, it's mostly a medieval world where every once in a while something, like, there's some magic and it's weird and nobody quite understands how it works. That's a soft magic system. If, you know, magic made the trains in Westeros run on time, but it was still only explained as much as it is in the books right now, that would not be a soft magic system. That's a magic system everyone is using. Soft magic doesn't just refer to the rules being ambiguous or vague. It also refers to how much of it is in the world. One of the problems you run into a lot in actually Harry Potter is that the magic system was originally designed to be funny, and then in later books she tries to put a lot of weight on the magic system and the world building that doesn't work. And so you get questions like, why does nobody use a sniper rifle on Voldemort? Or, like, why don't they just get themselves food all the time? And she has to kind of retcon things. That's an extent where the rules of the magic are very ambiguous. And so when it's an everyday thing taken in a realistic and not a comedy child's book, it becomes a problem.
Also, the highlight of a soft magic system is that it is generally tied to a sense of spiritualism or non-concrete rules. So, for instance, using Uprooted, her magic, the way she uses it, feels much more soft magic because it doesn't have set rules. It is a little bit more intuitive and separate versus
spiritual
his,
also.
which is, his is much more, the male main character in that book is much more hard magic because there are distinct rules, exact ways to work it, functions like almost like a formula to do it. So unfortunately, this magic system on surface feels like a hard magic system to me. There are distinct rules. It's literal formulas.
Deodorant said, an equation of ice and fire would have been such a different experience. Excellent pun, guys.
And Greta says, formations depend on belief and conformity. That's why they have the ritual sacrifices. Yes, there is that sense of, like, spiritualism to it, but there's also, like, the calendar, which is tied to like specific power points, which is tied to these ritualized, which can also just be like a formula for how to do it. It's based in math. All of those things, for me, I'm not saying it is absolutely a hard magic system, but it reads to me like a hard magic system or a sci-fi thing that forgot the explanation. It doesn't feel mystic or distant enough or unknowable. That's the other thing. A lot of soft magic systems, when you read them, not all of them, but a lot of them feel a bit unknowable. There's a sense of like things will happen as they'll happen. You're not exactly sure, like, or you're tapping into a force of nature, something like that. And this doesn't have that for me. It feels much more like the characters in it feel like they know what's going to happen based on certain things that they input. And it's why mathematicians are important. And because they know what the outcomes will be if they get the right formula, that feels like hard magic to me more so than soft magic.
And another problem is that, again, we have no idea what the limits of this are. Like, literally anything can work. So a similar system that I think Yoon Ha Lee ripped off, and I think it's very obvious in terms of comparison between the two factions, is in that Warhammer, the orcs have a gestalt field within them, and anything they believe sufficiently in a Wa, which is a large group of them, actually becomes kind of true. So, for example, the red one goes fastest is a belief of theirs, so if they paint something red, it will actually go faster than it would otherwise. This is how a lot of their wacky technology works. But, like, in that case, the limits of it are actually pretty clear in that, like, it can kind of make weird, scrappy technology that looks cool but shouldn't function. But it's not like all of a sudden they can, like, call down like an angel from above. Like, that would just be a weird thing to do. The limits of it are actually very clear. In this case, they have all kind of exotic magics, and you're like, okay, but we never understand even a vague. Again, there's no sense that under the ice there's a system that makes sense and we just can't see it, which you can kind of instinctually sense a lot of the time. And again, there's no. It's so abstract. She's constantly talking about all these math equations she's doing, but we don't understand what they are.
Miss Ally Snow, because a couple of points being brought up. In real life, math feels like soft magic to me sometimes. Angry Otter says, just because it has math, it can't be a soft magic system. Math is pretty unknowable to a lot of people. I think it is as unknowable as quantum physics. I'm sure people know some of it, but I won't understand it. And then Miss Ally Snow says, our main character is someone who does know the math, supposedly, and who can predict the outcomes. Like, if she gets the right, like, once she has a full understanding of the situation at hand, she can get the right formation to do a specific concrete outcome. Like, if it worked like wild magic, sorcerers in D&D, where like you roll a dice and depending how that dice goes, it's going to be a magic like you roll the formula and you hope it comes out well, but instead of like a kaleidoscope bomb, it's a fungus bomb. That feels that for me would make it feel more soft magic.
Angry Otter says math is pretty unknowable to a lot of people. I agree. But here's the thing. He should not have couched in math, because math is actually one of the things in the universe that is very knowable if you study it. It is they often call it the only truth, because it's like the only thing you can know for sure is 1 + 1 or whatever will always equal 2. Bearing in mind our understanding of it, like, there's a whole thing about it. But basically, math is a thing you can understand, and so it should make more sense. So if he had couched it in like emotion or something like that, then that would have made more sense as like, okay, they're drawing from the great spirit in the sky and they can pull down and do things. That would have made more sense as well. But putting it in the guise of math, people understand math. So, like, it's inherently a system that doesn't make sense as one that no one can understand. And also, again, he does nothing to actually even try to couch this in like math language. So, for example, in the formations, it's not like she says like, oh, it was a pentarch, but that had too many points of resistance between them, so she spread them out into, I have no idea what math is, guys. So like a rectangle, which then had more points of or more angles of something.
Just to answer the question, yes, he was talking about Cheris and the math she was writing, not the author. Here's the thing. If you haven't noticed, with the back and forth between us and our patrons, you're going to have different experiences with this book. You might fall more on Will and I's side, where you look at this and you go, ugh, I would have liked more explanation. Or you might look at it and go, math is weird and crazy and kind of magic, and it's a soft magic system. I don't need it to be explained to me. And like, fair. Unfortunately, as a reader coming into it, especially given the trappings of a sci-fi world, and like, it's not like Hyperion explains its science well, but it explains its concepts and the conceit of its world. It explains very well, and this just was missing, especially that first third, to make me feel comfortable. Like, a lot of these questions don't get answered, and also this first scene. This first chapter is the most explicit we get about the formations and their use in a battle. It never is going to get explained more explicitly than it does in this first chapter. That's why I reread it, to see if it made more sense, because this first chapter hits the ground running. It goes. It is a battle. There is there's literally a point where she has to take all the power and energy from all of her troops, funnel it into herself to be able to run the calculations fast enough to figure out what is happening on this battlefield to get the correct formation to beat it. And she ends up having to use a heretical formation, which means not one approved by the calendrical calendar. The explanation I just gave you is as much explanation as you get about how the system works. If you're the kind of person who would like, you hear those concepts and you're like, that sounds fascinating, I want more detail, it's not going to give you that. If you're the kind of person who goes, I don't care about any of that, like, I don't want to know the detail about that, then this book will probably really work for you, unfortunately. And you guys know this because I've waxed poetic about the tiny little world building details that I adore, that make me feel really couched into a story. And as a reader, this book has a lot of it. And here's the thing, on a language level, I actually think his writing is pretty funny and good, especially on the second reread. There was a lot of little tiny lines that connect to later issues.
I got to go back to the magic system before we go on.
Okay, you go.
Angry Outer says, I thought of it as a logic puzzle. You can set whatever rules and figure out the outcome based on those rules. And then Lindbergh said, more explanation would indicate there was some amount of explanation, to be fair. And I think they're referring to Angry Outer there. And yes, that is the problem. And one of the big problems with this book is, if it is supposed to be a soft, unknowable magic system, that is actually canonically incorrect, because Chet Karras does understand this system. It's only that she's not communicating it to us, and the book is not communicating to us. It's not a soft system. It just isn't, because again, she understands it and she understands how it works. There's never a point in the narrative, for example, she gets frustrated at the arbitrariness of, why does this work and then that doesn't work? She understands it. It's not soft to her. It's only soft to us as the audience. And the problem is that we are in her viewpoint. This would be different if it was like, the Hobbits with Gandalf. And let's assume that Gandalf understands how this works, but he never explains it to the Hobbits. And then it can you can get dividends from it being a soft magic system, but that's not really the case. And again, I don't think he gets anything in the book from it being a soft magic system. I just fundamentally don't think he gets any dividends for it.
It's not necessarily like adding as much as it just becomes a bit of a background piece in that way. Highlighting other comments, Angry Otter said, I thought of it like a logic puzzle.
I said that one.
Whatever.
Which actually, again, I would have liked. I would have liked if, again, it was like, okay, we're switching to a base 10 system now so that, all of our gravity troops can fly. You actually kind of need to understand these things if you're going to try and write a system like that.
Judo shoes. I do have an issue when it does that Wheel of Time name form thing where we're supposed to understand what two bears high-fiving formation looks like. And it's there's a lot of things where you're like, I don't understand. Because they again, a lot of the backgrounds and settings are a bit vague. And you guys that enjoyed it, let me know if you had a different experience. But I had a hard time as far as what things looked like around the characters, understanding what that looked like. So tell me if somebody else, like what your thoughts were on it. Celia says, Maria agreed. I read the first chapter and was interested in the math and I wanted more and then I didn't get it. So again, depending on how you're going to go into this. And for me, I don't like math. I'm a terrible math student, but I've never seen
math is a plague.
I've never seen a fantasy, like a sci-fi fantasy system, like engage with math in this way where it becomes like a tool of magic. Mwah, fascinating. Miss Alex Snow says the book might as well have just said, and then she used the Force instead of yammering about math.
Okay. And here's the thing. I said this. The Force is actually a good example of this because it's like, how does it work? It flows, we're forgetting the prequels. It flows from all living things. Okay, cool. We understand it's a basic force. It can do like 3 things, and that's it. Again, forgetting extended universe for a second. And so it actually has, okay, we don't understand how it works entirely, but we have the conceit that it flows from living things and some people can use it. And B, we don't really need to worry about it doing anything. It can't suddenly lop off everybody's limbs in a special area because it's an exotic power that works when you are like force inhaling. Like it's actually very limited in what it can do, which is good for the stakes of the story.
Pearl said, maybe Yoon Ha Lee was just replicating my university math lectures. You think you're going to understand, then the teacher starts talking and you understand nothing. Judo Shrew says, I think hard magic lends to simplicity because readers must understand the system, but this refuses to be that. If we're using by refusing to explain it, it is not a hard magic system as a thing, then yeah. But I would still argue that I don't necessarily think that
really
by
understand
refusing to explain it, that it's not a soft, that makes it soft. But I don't know. Again, depending on your interaction with this book, you're going to have completely different... Some people love this book, and I can understand why. And some people are not going to love this book. You, my readers, you fellow viewers who have not already read this for the Patreon book club, you should join. It's a good time. The Discord was popping this month with... back and forth.
I created a new channel for final thoughts because the people were talking so much that I realized I wasn't going to be able to go back through all of it and read all everybody's opinions before we got there. Pearl says, "No, Will, you must mention the midichlorians." No.
One of the things that I was going to mention is that the main character Karis does not. It's written in third person and mainly follows Karis as a point of view character, but we don't get a lot of communication. We get a lot of her thoughts about immediate things, but you don't get a lot of communication about what she thinks about things as a whole. A couple of comments highlighting that. There's a lot of things Karis doesn't communicate to us. Lindbergh says, Karis treats communication like it's the enemy. And Grutter says, I meant the entire calendar is like a logic puzzle created by the leaders to make what they want to work happen. And that I will agree with. There definitely is the idea because we meet other calendars that work differently because they're based off of different base numbers, but we don't know why they're different.
Differently? But again, like that's the thing is like it's not like
they work exactly the same. It's just a different set of parameters to start it. That's
the thing is it's so arbitrary, and yet the characters keep acting like it's not. And also, it's just boring to have the heretical system work like your system, but behind the scenes, maybe it's different.
No, but people voted on the parameters this time.
But again, it does the same thing, and that's boring.
Yes, but they got to vote on it. The population got to vote on the parameters of the calendar.
That's what's heretical about it. This is actually probably a good place to transition to talking about Karis, which is the other big problem with this book.
For some people.
Again, I am making the argument, not that you need to like this book, but that this is not the best version of the book is trying to be.
Wait. So I'm so sorry. I asked a question about the descriptions and some people answered it. Judo Shrew says, yeah, I think descriptions were a big issue. Pearl says, oh yeah, there wasn't much visual description. And Lindbergh said, we got a strong visual of carnage at the beginning, but the rest is just a flight through black space in my mind. Except for the servitors, because their shapes are clearly defined.
So Karis is like, again, infantry commander. She's leading her platoon into battle, but guess what? Command has been too rigid, and because of it, everybody for her has been slaughtered. It's that whole thing. But like, she's like, okay, our formations aren't going to work, so I'm going to twist them again in an abstract way that's never explained to match up more with the heretical system, so that our like cool laser swords can continue to work. And so you figure out that she's like really good at math, where most Kel, which is the military caste she's part of, aren't. And she gets to the main generator that they were trying to get, and then Command calls in and is like, forget that, we have a more important job for you now. And so you're like, oh, this is an inhuman system that like kind of treats its soldiers as disposable. Now, this is where we run into another world building problem, which is that this system... So the Kel have basically brainwashed into them in academy or whatever an extremely strong hierarchical system of command where they have to basically do things that people above them in command say. How to put this? There's a problem here where the society does not feel very rigid, despite us being told that it is very rigid, and that Karis is very flat as a character because it's rigid. So in the Temeraire books, we talked about how Lawrence, the main character, like Novik gets you immediately into the viewpoint of this culture to the point where you are beginning to second guess questions like, oh, there's a sticky social situation. And then in my head, I was like, okay, but they could do this. No, that wouldn't work because of this and that. Like, there is a system that, even though it is not necessarily explained to you, you immediately start to grok the underlying values and what the web looks like. And this book doesn't do that. Like, in that book, right off the bat, in the first chapter, we had, Lawrence having the whole ceremony of his sword. Like, should he give the captain he defeated his sword back? No, because he wasted his men in battle versus spending it. And then later he's like, oh, yes. Or like he was going to let off one of the younger lieutenants because whatever, but he doesn't because the lieutenant had spoken in and broken command, and now he can't be shown to be favoritism. Lawrence as a character is very bound by his culture, and his actions are always, again, there's this hilarious thing about how him and his father can't, his father assumes this young girl he works with is his daughter, but there's no way in terms of propriety for him to ever tell his father that she's not, because neither would ever suggest it. He is bound by these rules. He thinks by these rules, he acts by these rules, and even the prose reflect a real stiffness in how he thinks. Karras is not like this. Karras just isn't. Actually, and the problem is we actually get the viewpoint of a few other characters who are like her, who are Kel in the book, and they also are not like this. They are actually they really don't care about hierarchy. Like, there's one of the soldiers who mostly is like, yeah, I'll get to the orders, but I'm mostly thinking about show tunes in my head while this goes on. Or another of them that's mostly thinking about something else. They're not constrained by their culture.
The one who was like, the formation instinct never worked on me. And so we're shown much more like abnormal Kel than we're shown what the actual Kel culture should look like. And the big thing is, we never know in a lot of ways what her personal beliefs are. You learn a bit about her as a character, such as she was from this like obscure little planet that is a bit old-fashioned. So while it's part of the Empire, it's enough different that other people kind of look down on it, and she really wanted to belong, and that's why she chose to join the Kel. But she's really good at math, and there was a debate about this in the Discord, so I'm going to probably reopen the debate by bringing it up. But there's this big concept of, as a reader, I looked at it and went, why did you join the Kel? Why didn't you, if all you were looking for was to belong to a group, you could have done that in the Narai, and you're good at math. You could have done that you in like 5 of the different factions, and the only one that doesn't feel like a united group is the Shuos, and it's because everybody needs to kill each other to become the leader. But besides that, you could have belonged, and maybe it's because the Kel are the most belongy / bro guys that it was, but we're never told why that was the choice, and we're never told, like, does she actually like the Empire? Why is she loyal? Why is she loyal?
Okay, so the book basically is trying to say that there is a conflict. The heart at war with itself is one of the kind of fundamental conflicts of fiction, as Martin would say. Take a shot.
Terrible.
I need to back up a little bit more because this got a lot of discussion in the Discord, in that a lot of people were saying that she is hard to relate to as a character because she's so bland and she doesn't emote a lot and she doesn't really think about things a lot. And then there was discussion that you're not supposed to relate to her as a character, which... unless we've read some author interviews, I'm not sure why why we're assuming that versus him just being bad at making people relate to her. But even taking that assumption that he is trying to make her not a character you relate to a lot, there's a problem where that is a massive tool in fiction, is getting you to relate to a character so that you care about the stakes, because it causes a cascade failure. One of the examples I use is that you care a lot when your grandfather dies, but you fundamentally cannot care when somebody in a nursing home dies unless you are relating to them in a way where you are remembering your own grandfather dying or thinking about your own mortality. Like, that's how humans work. We have mirror neurons. We really only care about things that we think are ourselves. Kind of. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's how fiction works. We think we're the character, so we care about them. If we don't think we're the character, then it's hard to care about the stakes, because what do the stakes... And this happens even in stories where you do relate to the character, but the character isn't tied to the stakes of the story. You then don't care about the stakes. It's the same reason a book about, like, Are they going to be able to keep the bread farm in their family? Can have the same emotional weight as, are we going to save the universe? One of these in the trolley problem is clearly a more impactful thing, but because of the stakes inherent, because we relate to the character and we care about what they care about, we care about if they keep the bread farm in the family. So it causes a cascade problem of we then don't care about what's happening as much if we don't relate to the character.
In Grace of Kings, we had a whole discussion about how if the plot and other stuff is really good, it doesn't need to be as character focused. And Grace of Kings is a perfect example. Grace of Kings does not necessarily care about the individual characters. It cares about the giant story it is telling. It is a story about power bouncing back and forth and the rise and fall of an empire. That is what that book cares about, and that is what it is focusing on. So the individual characters themselves, we don't get a lot of emotionality. We're not really super close to them a lot of the time. A lot of it is told in summary and not in scene. And so I don't think if you have something else you are really focusing on that the characters need to be that thing.
The really good example I brought up is Jurassic Park.
Jurassic Park.
Characters there are actually flat. You're very in a clinical distance tone from them. And yet it's such an intense book because he makes the plot work. He makes the horror work. You start feeling like you're part of the characters, even though they're relatively flat.
You don't need that, but there needs to be something else that keeps me like, ooh, I'm in it. I'm here to see the outcome of it.
Snarky textbook in Grace of Kings, for example.
Snarky textbook, but also I was invested in the rise and fall of the empire. That was that was the thing. Like, how is this going to go down? How are we going to break apart this? Like how are we splitting this pig? You know? And then we get it gets reunited at the end. And so I was invested in that as a concept, I want to see how the textbook ends kind of thing. And for me, because one of our patrons, Judo Shu says, I take those things as an understatement. Karis is traumatized and does not express herself. She is stunted. I could see that, but I have no evidence of what traumatized her. Unless the implication is just joining the military traumatized her.
No. We have no implication that actually even happens. We have nothing, like Jadao later will have some very vague, this inciting incident happened. We don't see, for example, a unit got decimated. 1 in 10 of them were killed after they undid their orders. She saw a friend of hers, die in a training accident or caused by incompetence. We don't get that. She went through physical. They beat her. There was physical punishment at play. She's not traumatized by it. You can read into her behavior that she's traumatized, but there's no reason to think that that's actually true. There's no evidence for it in the text. The other thing is you can write a compelling character who emotes very little. One of the things that I was so impressed about in Scorpio Races was that the main male character doesn't say a lot and yet somehow still has a lot of character, because that's something I struggle with, is I like my characters not to talk, but then they just become very flat. And so I'm not really sure. And I think Lindbergh said this above, but because she's so muted, you can kind of read a lot into her if you want. You can project a lot. And that's kind of like the Bella Swan argument, which is that the more the character is in every person versus an actual character, the more you can think of them as yourself. But I don't think that actually works here.
And the thing is, it does work for some people. Sirius/Judo Shu just said, he cared about Karis, the whole way through. He cared and was invested. For me, even if we're even if she is traumatized, because Pearl says, psychologically, I would say she reads as traumatized, and then trauma doesn't always make itself obviously shown. That is valid, but then at some point, I would have liked maybe towards the end where we get this is the thing. This is that thing that happened earlier that you didn't understand. That was a trauma response because of this thing that happened in her past. And then you can click together all the ways that she has been a distant, cut off person. And the book didn't give us that. And maybe it's something that happens in later books. But for me, the problem is I just didn't connect to her enough as a character. And my argument before is you don't have to have characters where you're supposed to connect with them. There has to be other stuff. But I didn't care enough about the social structure, and there was no point at which I was invested. So the big conceit of this book is, surprise, the Empire's evil.
Do you get it? They work in swarms and they have a caste system.
And they have 6 factions and ritual days. And the idea is that by the end of it, Karis and this other character are going to rebel and do the thing. And this would have worked more for me, and I would have been more invested and felt personally betrayed if I believed in the Empire as a system, or just not even believed in it, but just from the beginning thought it was like a fine system.
Or Karis cared about the system at all. She doesn't. She has no ideology whatsoever. She literally is just like, I'm going to just keep going forward. I don't, there's no installation of, a military sense of brotherhood within her. She kind of cares about her troops, but only in kind of a vague, distant, like, I care about people because I'm a good person, not in a, these are my brothers. It's not like they're the Spartans where they're all sleeping with each other. It's not like there's an espirited corpse, as you would say in France, though France lost its last major war, so I don't know why we use French for anything military. But there's no sense that like, or she even believes in this system. There was a Warhammer book I read a while ago that I really liked because it's about someone in the Inquisition, which is the empire, which is essentially fascist, but also sort of the good guys. And it's slowly her being stripped away from her beliefs and her having to remake herself each time her beliefs get cracked, until at the end she's like, no, I can't support this system anymore. At first, she's betrayed by the bureaucracy, and she's like, okay, but it's about the good of the empire, not the good of the bureaucracy. And then the empire betrays her, and she's like, okay, it's not about the civilization, it's about the emperor himself, my relationship to him. And then she learns that he betrayed somebody, and at that point she's like, fuck it, we're doing chaos, I'm gonna bang this chaos marine even though he doesn't know it yet. But there was no sequel, so that didn't happen.
And that's exactly the thing that we don't get, is there's no, so again, if I wasn't going to be invested in the characters, which again, you don't have to be, we've mentioned multiple books that do a fantastic job of not caring too much about the characters but focusing on other things, then I need to care about something else. And I could have cared about the Empire, or just like their cause. I could have cared about the cause, but I didn't, because I always knew it was evil. So when it was like, Sacre Bleu, they're evil. And again, I don't think the book was trying to make this a surprise. I think, I don't think that was, it's so obvious that I think he's like, the author's like, haha, is an evil empire. Again, they're called swarms.
It's literally like, oh no, in modern literature, an empire that controls everybody's thoughts and has a flat hierarchy is going to be good. Like, no, it's so clearly against everything that we would consider good.
But for me, that could have built tension if I had believed in the cause. Like, if I genuinely thought the rebels were evil for a minute, and then it was like, Sacre Bleu, the rebels were like, and that was the way it shifted my expectations and broke through stuff. And then Karis being like, oh my god, they're evil. And even the moment where Karis is like, I shall now become a heretic, I don't understand why she personally has become besides the fact that, like, I don't know, she ate Jadao and now she has his heretical beliefs inside her. But there was never a moment where I felt from her genuinely that she was like, fuck the system, burn it to the ground. And I would have liked that, because that's growth. I don't have to be invested in you emotionally, but I like watching someone go from a true believer to a skeptic. And I didn't see that either.
Miss Ali Snow says Karis goes heretical at the end because, ellipses, the evil empire tried to kill her and her soldiers, even though, as far as I know, they've essentially been doing that since the day she joined up. Okay, this is another bizarre thing, is that the conflict, I think, in this book, though it's very muted, and her character arc, is that she cares about her troops, and she's seeing how the ways that the empire doesn't care about its troops and just spends their lives like nothing, and spends the lives of civilians like nothing. But if you have the power to brainwash your soldiers into following all your orders, why would you not also brainwash them with the belief that victory is everything, that they are beings to be spent? Like, that's a thing that like normal militaries even try to do. I just don't understand why the culture of the Kel would not be like, oh good, we're getting spent on a decoy raid, that's awesome, the management knows what's going on, and that's what's, or even something like that. Like, something I once read about dogs is that dogs actually really only care about the hierarchy being strong. Like, they don't actually care that they're submissive to somebody else. Like, in human society, that's like considered a bad thing to be submissive, but in a dog, it's like, okay, no, it's good if you put me down. Now we know where the hierarchy is. I don't understand why the Kel wouldn't have that kind of thought process, where it just matters that the command is confident. It doesn't really even matter what's going on. And so it seems like just a big lapse in judgment to make your soldiers care about themselves.
Judo True says, I think the issue wasn't supposed to be that the Empire is evil. Again, I agree. I don't think I think he was explicitly making them evil from the start. It's that they have no gratitude at all, that the sacrifices meant nothing, just like chapter 1. That's the flaw entirely for me. Serious. That is the flaw entirely. We know it from chapter 1. If we know it from chapter 1 that they don't care about
She
their
knows
men.
it from chapter 1.
She knows it from before that.
Again, this isn't the Warhammer book where there are challenges along the way that make her beliefs change over the crucible of conflict. No, she just doesn't really care. She gets really stressed out because she doesn't sleep enough as the book goes on. That's her conflict.
Angry Otter makes the point. Karason out at the end. She didn't really have that opportunity before. Fair. But if that's the case, then she was always a heretic?
Yeah, and was just waiting to get out?
Because I didn't get that. Like, if that was there, I didn't... Again, when I was rereading it, there was that part where she was like, and she saw the banner go up, and her secret heart, like, looked away. And it was, like, one line. And I'm like, were there more tiny lines like this that I missed because the book was going at a breakneck speed the whole time? But I don't remember any... Even the points where she's, like, thinking and Jadao's, like, commenting on her face... I don't remember points at which she actively felt like she was already a heretic and was just looking for an out. And here's the thing. If I like the idea that if she was really traumatized and isolated and not connecting with people, then perhaps her interactions with Jadao and getting close to Jadao would bring her out of her shell, so that the Karis halfway through the book is just a bit more emotionally reactive or giving more of herself. And then the reader can go, oh, that's because she was just so isolated, focused on her duty and all of that. But now that she has someone that she's actually bonding with on a personal level, we're getting a bit more of her.
Challenging a static character into being a more active one through what they're going through is fascinating. Lawrence in Temeraire. One of the things that I find endlessly funny about that book, the first book, is like Temeraire will ask him questions that challenge his point of view on the world, and he's like, I don't know. Like, I just do what I've been told this whole time. Like, he's a very non-political in a way. And so it's always interesting to see a character challenge with it, but we don't really get that. Also, Pearl says, I don't think you need a complete arc to fight Evil Empire. Lol, how many people do not complete arc for a true believer for the system? In fuck the system?
To fuck the system. Her arc is, I should fight.
But that isn't an arc, because she what does she experience through the book that changes her mind? She like loses some troops, but also she doesn't super care about. Literally what happens is she's sort of a passive character in that she gets betrayed and she's like, well, I don't really have any other options. Like, that's the thing, is it's kind of like, it's not a choice she makes to betray the Empire betrays her. And so there's no like real growth. Like, bear in mind, this is like a 10-hour book. This is not a short story. This is a book in its own right. Because I've also seen some people defend it for like, oh, it's the first book, you don't really need to be doing that much. No, you do.
Connecting to something that Angry Otter said, it did show her caring about killing her soldiers, though, and she had no reason to trust Jadao. Correct. But she also cared about her soldiers dying from the beginning. Like, it wasn't like a thing that appeared. Again, all I wanted, which didn't happen for me, was either to connect with Karis enough to like follow her story, or to see some development in the story plot as a whole to justify like from the beginning to the end. And I from her personally, I don't understand how she ended up in that end place. And again, I'm going to go back to this 100 times. Obviously, people are interacting with this book on very different levels, and all of our patrons are really smart. And a lot of these people we have used, like Angry Otter, we've used their comments 100 times. Serious Shenanigans, Lindbergh, like, we have smart patrons, and I'd like to think we're relatively smart, but there are two reading experiences happening here, and maybe a couple others splashed in, and depending on what kind of reader you are and what you want, this book is either going to like work really well. A couple of our patrons literally said that it's in a lot of books they don't feel like their needs or what they want are being met, and like what they want out of a book isn't happening, and that for them this book felt like a book for them, like it was written for their specifications and what they want. And I feel that because I read Spinning Silver and was like, this is great. This is everything I want. And it is by far one of Novik's least well-received books. Like, it absolutely is. And for me, it's like near perfect.
I would make the argument, though, that Spinning Silver is the best version of itself in that it wants to have that slow pace and it wants to have Stepan for some reason that I don't understand, but I think it understands. Whereas I don't think this is the best version of itself. There's no reason the factions need to be so confusing. There's no reason the it gets no, if it's trying to have a soft magic system, it gets no dividends from those because it's not a soft magic system. Karis understands it, we don't. And then in terms of Karis as a character, I don't think we get anything from her not having an arc. She's not, the thing about it is that if you're going to have a static character, this can work, but what happens is your understanding of the character actually needs to change throughout the work, and there's nothing actually to understand about her. She is, maybe she's traumatized. We don't know. I mean, that's the thing you would think to explore with a character if they do have interesting behaviors. She's really just like a normal person who walked into this. It's weird because she's not even very ambitious. You get the sense early in the book that, oh, okay, this is a thing with her, but then she's like doesn't super care. It's interesting. I think again, I'm being tough on this book because I was just very disappointed because I thought he was a good writer. And I thought that this was going to be a smart book, and it's not to me.
I really think that I am in so many ways, like, again, I don't know how many times I've mentioned I like a slower, more like developed, I like really solid world building and understanding what I'm looking at. And this book for me had, and again, the concepts are so cool. The idea of a calendrical empire,
So cool.
based on
So
a
cool.
calendar, based on math, and that you can, there's literally a point in the book where they realize they can fuck up the heretical calendar by moving one of, like, if there's a celebration day that isn't the dictated celebration day, it will weaken the entire heretical system, and then they'll be able to attack. Oh, that's amazing. And then like the strategy of, okay, how do you get them to celebrate on a day that they're not supposed to celebrate? You trick them into thinking they won something that you let them win, and then they're going to have a bunch of celebrations. It'll weaken the calendar, and then you can get in there and fuck shit up. That is such a cool concept. And I just...
Again, there's no real specifics done with it, and it's not really explained to us, the audience. Like, again, I think instead of the whole formation, or not formation, I think the whole formation thing is really interesting, especially in space where there is like no, where you can actually maintain geometric shapes. Like, that's such a cool idea. Or even they keep talking about the training or whatever that makes the Kel immediately subservient to people above them. I would have liked if that was actually a calendrical system. Like, reality made it so they had to do that thing versus brainwashing, because then you have like two different systems and there's no reason. It would have been so much more interesting if calendrical magic could actually change physics or change like real things instead of just being like, and now we have space death rays that are different than the others somehow. Angry Otter says Ninefox is like an inciting incident. Karis grows more once she's separated from Jadao and from under the Empire scrutiny. It's a 10-hour prologue.
Pearl mentions, and I'm highlighting this because as much as like this book doesn't do it for me, I do want to show that there are people who this book satisfied. It gave them what they wanted. They were engaged. You know, Pearl says, I still think her arc for book one is more than enough. I felt personally satisfied by the end of this book without wondering about the rest of the series. For me, it just wasn't the same reading experience. And it really, like, this is one of those books, like, sometimes it happens with Will and I, because you guys know we don't agree. Go watch our Annihilation video to see two completely different experiences about a book series. But there's almost a moment where, like, you're like, are we reading the same thing, or are our brains just that weird? Do the way people interact with things become so different at a certain point? Because there have been times where our entire little Discord group is just completely united. Like, there have been those moments. And then there's a time, and this is also just a pitch to join the Discord, because this is, like, these discussions, this back and forth, has been happening for, like, a month now. Like, there are some of these arguments that people have had, gone through, ended. We're bringing it back now because it's the live stream. But if you want a place where you feel like you can come talk about books and, like, not get, because we've heard, like, some of our patrons are part of other Discords where, like, if you have a differing opinion, you're lambasted for it. That ain't this place. And again, Will and I have liked books that the Discord did not. Sabriel. may you live long. But it's never like, yes, are there times it can get a little bit heated?
You know, it's funny because for the first year or so, things trundled along. I mostly trust you guys to behave. Everybody there is in a, like, not actually an adult, but an adult. Like you guys are all naturally very respectful of each other and different opinions, and you also articulate yourselves really well, which is nice. And then I don't know, a few months ago or something, there was a bit of a kerfuffle. So I outlined some rules for disagreements, and we just have not had any issues from then even.
Yeah.
So and things can get very heated, but I think we're all pretty good about it. So yeah, no, it's a good time.
And respectful. And if you want a place where you can talk about books and get into the nitty gritty and know that like on the next book when you and the person you were arguing swords at dawn with about that other book, and now suddenly you're agreeing point for point, join our Discord. I cannot say how cool of a place it is.
Organic marketing. And that's why Maria actually isn't even there that much.
I might not be commenting, but I am reading what people are saying because we have to get to this point and we have to talk about it. And I like to make sure, like, even though this book wasn't for me and I didn't enjoy it, a lot of our patrons did. And I am going to tell you that.
Well, and actually, even in disagreement, again, seeing so many people like it made me make my points more granular and specific than just like vibes. There is a, not to go full shonen anime, but like, rivals do make each other better sometimes, like that's a whole thing in shonen anime where it's like, we're rivals, but we forced each other to become better, Sasuke. Like, there's that whole thing. Like, it actually does make you kind of force you to be good in a Socratic method kind of way. Anyway, I think we should think about what we're going to do for the rest of the review because we never got past chapter 3. I can summarize this book in 5 minutes if you
wait. I'm gonna give it a relatively short college try. Basically,
you're gonna fail. You're so bad at summarizing things in a timely manner.
Just give me. I got this. Basically, there is a heretical takeover in one of the main like power points of the empire. It's called the something of needles, bastion of
Forest
needles?
of 1,000 needles.
No,
not forest.
No.
Fortress of 1,000
Fortress of 1,000 needles. And it's a big, like, it is a point in their web because, like, this is a universe expanding, like a galactic empire. And the fortress is one of its power points that distributes calendrical power across in this sector of space. But it has been taken over by heretics, which is a big problem because now a huge portion of their stuff is no longer working in this area, so they got to take care of it. So there's this guy, Shuos Makudes. He is the head of the thing, and he's like, we got to deal with this. We're going to have to use our secret weapon. Who is going to use the secret weapon? That Karis girl's really smart. She's good at math. I shall trick this, or I will try get this other guy, Narai Shugen, to agree with it. And then he's like, yeah, I like that she's into math. And now Karis, instead of being a leader, is now in charge of the evil or the powerful weapon that they're going to use to take down the fortress. Except it's a guy. 400 years ago, there was this really, really good general who was like amazing. He was a Shuos. He ended up working for the Kel, and he did some war crimes. He did war crimes on enemies, which everybody really liked. But then, at this one massacre, he massacred everyone on the good side. And they don't like war crimes against their people, so this was an issue. So they killed him, but they didn't kill him. They put his mind in this thing called the Black Cradle. And every time they need to use him for tactical expertise, they bring his mind back. And Karis was like, we should use him, even though this is what they wanted her to say, and use him to deal with the Fortress of Needles stuff. And then they put him in her mind because he doesn't have an actual body. They don't wake him up from sleep. They just put his mind into her mind. And so now she's just got a guy living about in there. And they're like, careful, he's crazy. If he ever starts sounding like the sane one and everybody else sounds crazy, that's when you know you have to take him out. Ooh. And basically they go on campaign and they have to be, Jadao has ideas about how to deal with stuff. And there are points where Karis is like, how could you kill all of your people and your troops? And I'm like, you have a lot of feels about this for someone who's like, yeah, absolutely, we should wake him up and use him as a tool. And then she's like, you monster! And I was like, I don't understand that. I would have liked a little bit more explanation of what that was. But anyway, so they end up working together pretty well, where Jadao subtly starts teaching her things and imparting to her some wisdom. And you get the idea that maybe he's not insane. Maybe a lot of his choices were very intentional, but you're not sure why. The massacre of a ton of people was the idea, but they end up working together. to take control of the swarm they've been given. And Jadao's methods are often not things that Karis immediately goes for, and he's able to manipulate her in a couple of ways, and I'm not going to go into detail individually, to do what he thinks needs to be done. But while this is happening, she's beginning to vaguely trust him, vaguely get and there's moments where you feel like she's trusting him, and then there's other moments when she's like, nah, you're an evil madman, I don't like you. And a lot of what he does is the Shuos really like games, so they do a lot of stuff with games and stuff like that. But eventually, the idea you get is Jadao is actually a pretty good guy. Something has happened. The Empire is not great. In between all of this, you've been getting letters from this person who I'm just going to call VH.
She's funny. She's the best part of the book.
Yeah, I loved her.
One of the problems with the book is that he's actually very good at writing kind of slightly funny characters, but that doesn't match up with a culture that's supposed to be completely fascist and like tamped down on. And so it's one of the reasons that like I feel like this book is not playing to his strengths as a writer. And so like again, you have instances where the Kel people we run into are thinking about show tunes instead of war, and you're like, okay, but then this destroys your world building if they're all supposed to be really loyal.
That wasn't one of the biggest issues. We were never in the mind of a Kel who felt like a normal Kel. Like, they were all just a little off or had issues. But anyway, Vahens, I'm just going to call her VH. She is advising the person who is like who has taken over the fortress of a bunch of needles.
Scattered needles, apparently.
Scattered needles. It's Leosh Zai is the person. And this person is technically not a Leosh in the sense that the Leoshes have been dead for like 100 years ever since their rebellion went bad. But this person believes in, because the Leosh were the philosophers, they thought through things, all of that. And Leosh Zai has taken on that mantle. And VH we're introduced to her by just a bunch of letters that she is writing to Zai. And the letters are hysterical. You get in this that like people are voting on calendar names and hour names and stuff like that. And you get a little snatch of what's happening on the enemy side. It's in those where you're like, oh, maybe the and again, you know the Empire's evil from the start, but like from these, you get the idea that like, these sound like pretty normal bureaucrats, but Vahens is just hysterical. The planet has these shields, and they're like, nobody can get into these shields. They're so powerful. And Jadao's like, there's a human operator. We just gotta fuck with their mind. Mental warfare. And they fuck with the guy's mind. He breaks down. The shields go down. They pretend they're like, ooh, we're actually here to join you. We're rebels as well. And then the people on the ground are like, maybe you are, maybe you aren't. We don't trust you yet. There's a lot of tiny little skirmishes that are happening.
I will say that I think one of the reasons I could hang with this book, even though all the problems I had with it, is that I do like military fiction. And this isn't great military fiction, but it is military fiction. And we scratch that itch so little on this channel that I was like, ooh, space battles.
I like the space, and I liked some of the tinier skirmishes. Like, those scenes were a little bit more compelling to me than some of the other stuff. Like, in a lot of ways, again, I was like, are you good guys or bad guys? I don't know. And then eventually I'd be like, oh, okay, you are good guys.
Pearl says that one of the in terms of me liking it, it's not because Vans is a bitchy hot girl. You know, again, she is a great character. She's really, I'm sad about what happens at the end of the book, because book 2 could have just been her.
And also, Lindbergh has her whole name, and I kept trying to say it over and over again every time we heard it in the audiobook, but it didn't get said enough. It was Vahanza Fear Dynome. Great name, but also the craziest name in the book. Sirius says, the scene with the Luckstone was fantastic. I actually really liked that scene, and it's because we were getting a lot of emotional reactions out of Karis and like her versus the like her programming, and then Jadao and like, is he going crazy? And it was a compelling scene, but like the emotionality of that scene didn't go anywhere for me.
Well, and it also kind of just nothing ever happens from it. She doesn't not trust him after this point. There's no actual like real impact from it. She isn't suddenly like questioning her own orders from other people more. So, like, there's just no impact. Again, she's a very static character.
They skirmish, they do stuff, but eventually, like I said, Karis realizes that they can mess with the calendar, if they fake a defeat, which the heretics absolutely are like, woo, we celebrate. And then Vahens is like, God, stupid, that stupid general of ours celebrating because he won a defeat that they let us. Like, why do we have so many dumb people? Again, she's like the best part of this book, old Vahens. And basically, it gets down to the point where like they're doing really well, and there's this point where they send out a message that basically shows that Karis is really, really good at math. And that's a problem because what we discover is that Jadao, oh no, he actually was a traitor. He didn't go insane. And that he had always been missing someone who was really good at math to compensate for the fact that he has dyscalculia. And that he can't do the math side of things. And then suddenly the entire empire is like, oh, she's really good at math. The Kel's like, we got to take him out. And they destroy the entire swarm that they're in charge of. They send in a carrion bomb, which turns everyone into thought memory icicles. And she's alive because one of the things you learn is that Jadao, as an implant in her, can protect her from exotic effects. So a carrion bomb is an exotic weapon, and so he takes it, so he gets turned into memory shards. And earlier, somebody basically told her, I think it was him, that if she ate his shards, she'd get his memories and stuff. So she starts eating shards. And so in the last third of the book, we get Jadao's experience.
It's like in Harry Potter where all of a sudden we have a chapter about Snape's backstory at the climax and you're like, it kind of works. By the way, I need to tell you there's an important thing happening in the comments, which is that everyone loves your shirt.
Thank you. My mom got it in South Africa. These are baobab trees. They're one of my favorite trees.
Well, they're not as cool as elephants, but that's still not bad. Yeah, and so basically she remembers Jadao's past, and we find out that he's a rebel because his friend committed suicide over a heretical thing. It's not well explained because I couldn't figure out if he was being a heretic before that or if that was an inciting incident. And if it was, it felt very distant as an inciting incident. And then it also didn't feel like something that grew throughout his career. It's a more explanation than you get for Karis, but like I didn't necessarily think it worked very well.
Question. At what point do you guys think Jadao went heretical and was working against the Empire? Because, I mean, I got the idea that it was when his friend committed suicide, but I didn't fully understand. Like, when he made the heretical game to, like, as a thought experiment, was he trying to, like, get people to turn into heretics? But if so, why? Why was he a heretic? Did he just have like a different mind?
He's from a minority, which you're told, but it's like, okay, so a good example of this is Hyperion. Hyperion is a book that shows you throughout the course of it. It's like a stealth book. You're all of a sudden at the end like, oh, the hegemony. Remember how much we had 6 videos and I still have trouble with the hegemony. The hegemony is like not good. And one of the ways that it does that is in like, you know, the last story with the whole thing of you see the hegemony with the dolphins. You see an example and you feel that like, okay, they're going to ruin this world through their expansion and also the whole stuff with the AI happening. You get a sense for why Merrick is like, no, fuck that. We're fighting them. Even though, again, then there's like the whole the consul. We talked about how that's a little bit messy in terms of motivation, but you get that sense of like, okay, we see the harm it's doing. We understand now. Whereas we understand the emotionality of his decision. Whereas here it's like his friend committed suicide off screen.
Because of a game that he made?
Right. And we also don't get any examples of like his home culture having lost their dolphins. You know, like it's very
or
distant.
Like his mom being a secret heretic. Like what made him start being a rebel?
Limbrick says, I think Jadao was a stupid piece of shit child who played with fire.
Also, there was a great, as Ally Snow says, oh dear Lord, they sent him a math tutor, destroy them all.
That's the other thing is that like she was like just good at math. She wasn't even like a progeny at math.
It does say that she is as good as Narai, like the guy who's been alive for 500 years. There is a point in the beginning, and I know because I reread it this morning where they say that. But again, it's not like
Oh.
it isn't mentioned enough for you to be like, ah, yes, she is one of the greatest
Well,
mathematical
and
minds.
also nobody else is like, oh my god, your math here skills are incredible. I just thought she was like normal
They were all
scribe
just like,
level.
oh wow, you're good at math for a Cal.
Kel are really stupid. That is one part of the book I liked, is that everybody's always talks about how stereotypically dumb the Kel are. Even the Kel think it's funny.
And they collect jokes about themselves,
Mhm.
which is great. And those are the kind of things that I like as world building. Like those little moments of like the Kells have a like file with all the jokes they hear about themselves. That's great. I wanted more of that. We didn't get it. Celia says, we could have had a backstory from Jadao and Karis bonding through telling stories of their training, so we got a better feel for both of their motivations when things gets revealed later and some of the bonding. I would have liked that. Sirius says, I'm not the happiest with Jadao's backstory and motivations. I think there's a frustration with the world rewarding people for things that kill people. Yes, I think there is a frustration, but that doesn't feel like enough of an inciting incident, especially because like the anger has to be a bit at himself for making this game that caused this outcome. And then you can also be mad at like them rewarding that lady for taking credit for it, but it didn't feel like enough of it. Anger Outer says, I think there were several incidents that led Jadao to that point. The problem is because we see a bunch of little scenes with him, like a ton. We get to see a scene where his superior officer like SAs him, basically grapes him. Not nice. And I'm like, okay, were you already a heretic at this point, or is this one of those moments that pushes you? And then there's moments where he is like, he's talking about how he is actively under the surface working against it, and I'm like, but wait, when did you go, I'm doing this? Or did it happen gradually and one day you realized, wow, I have been making unintentional decisions to mess with the like? But we don't get that. And so it was, as much as they were some of the most emotionally impactful scenes in the book,
It's kind of a low bar to clear. None of them are the dolphin scene. None of them carry the impact of that dolphin scene. And that's the thing, is like, in a book, you want scenes to have impact because they tell you about the characters and why they do things. Again, what is the basis really of his is it philosophical? Is it emotional? Is it cultural? You can kind of infer some of these things, but you never feel any of them.
Serious again. As I said, I'm not happy with the backstory. It's too much and at the same time not coherent enough. I really just don't get the moment. Like, what was his inciting incident? I don't understand. Like enough to make him commit to making himself a thing in the Black Cradle. So basically, he has this conversation with this guy, and one of the last scenes you see is this conversation with this dude where the guy's dying, and they basically confess that they're both like, bring down and the one guy's like, no one can do it in one lifetime. And then he's like, oh, I don't have to do it in one lifetime if they put me in the Black Cradle. And the guy's like, what are you going to do that's bad enough that is going to make them take notice of you enough to want to put you in the Black Cradle? And then you're like, oh, this is why he done the Heckin massacre. It was part of his plan. But, and hear me out, guys. Hear me out, okay? We are never even vaguely... He has been taken out of the Black Cradle, used to win wars, and he has won all of the things. He has done all the thing that they have asked him to, furthering the cause of the Empire. So up until this point, with her, and like the last chance that she's able to get out of this alive, but all he's been doing for the past 400 years is furthering their cause. Like, there's not a moment where they talk about like how they won this thing but they lost this, because that would have been really interesting. And if like they were like, oh, we can, like, we won this war, but then this one group disappeared, and you're like, ooh, what happened to them? Or like this thing happened, and like if throughout the book they just kept mentioning Jadao's victories, but then these tiny little comments about this thing that went awry, and then Jadao was like, those weren't accidents, those were all on purpose.
Or even like, oh, people think of that as a victory, but got us into this prolonged war where we lost a lot of troops, or something like that, where you're like, oh, or something where it's like he did such a harsh thing that it's going to radicalize the populace by letting them see the inner rot of the Arctic system. Like that's Dune's whole thing, is once Leto turns into a sandworm, his whole thing is he's going to oppress people so much they'll never be oppressed again. Like, it's not like he does that. It's literally just like, I'm going to win a lot of battles for them. Again, it feels like this book is missing a lot of details.
And here's a comment. Judo Shu says they talk about him being the prototype for formation instinct. Nah, I re-listened to that scene multiple times. I think Karis was bluffing. And she basically says she was bluffing. That she needed to distract them so that the other guys could kill, because they couldn't leave her alive to get off the ship, so that she had to distract them. So I think the whole thing of like, I have to have a master, I think that was a bluff.
Oh yeah, no, she's so totally lying there.
Because she literally said she had to think of a plan to distract the guy. I don't think that's actually what's happening with Jadao.
No, and it makes no sense for why he was doing what he was doing.
And if it is, Jadao himself never says it, because we basically get Karis going, and that was my plan, mahaha, and it worked, we killed her. So like, and because I re-listened to that scene like twice, maybe 3 times. And Judo Shrew mentions, yeah, I don't like that scene there because it's totally ambiguous. It is. Because the idea, the thing that I think was the lie is that Karis with Jadao's remnants and memories, so they are now like part Karis, part Jadao, tells Vahens Afir Dainom that, oh, how do you think they used me all this time? I am like a Gosling. I will imprint on whoever I see first and do all of their work. You can be the thing I imprint on. And that causes her to come out in front of them. And then one of the servitors shoots Vahens Afir Dainom, which best character just lost like that.
I don't understand why we didn't get rid of Karis and just have Jadao inside her. That would have been so good.
Or like them working together. I would have thought it was really interesting if they worked together, because I don't, like, I thought for the longest time that Vahens was on like the side of democracy and stuff, in which case, why wouldn't she ally herself with Jadao to take down? But then it seemed like she was also a double agent for something else. And so I don't actually, by the end, understand what her motivations or her goals were at all. But I thought it would have been really interesting if they joined together.
I thought for a little bit she might have been a Chuos, and it was one of these things where like there's double agents to double agents and none of them know that they're working. But no, it's not that. Yeah, so and then yeah, that's pretty much it. Karis and Jadao are now like one person. There's a whole plot with the servitor robots being more sentient than people think, but it never makes any sense in terms of a system where that's so fascist in terms of mind like games and control and stuff, that they just have this underclass of people who like are sentient but they don't know about, and then they just kind of help out.
And then when they realize that they kind of are sentient, because there's a point where Karis gives them a choice, it doesn't shake how they think about the servitors.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I really would have liked if when she did that, for people to go, oh my god, they make decisions, they're not just mindless robots. Wow. And for that to shake how, and for Karis to regret her decision, because maybe they're like, yes, we shall use them, or we need to destroy them, they can't be, like, that would have been an interesting, like, her thinking, okay, I'm empowering them, I'm not ordering them to do this, and thus giving them a choice, and then it having backlash on them. That would have been a great character moment, and her being like, I have to think harder.
Or even that's why the Hexarch goes after her, is because she has, like, power with the servitors versus just being able to do math.
There's a lot of little things with this book where, like, there's a lot of potential, and it doesn't like exactly land for me. I definitely think structurally, especially in the second half, the book goes a little bit like it's not as tight. And again, Sirius / Judo Shrew, one of the biggest in the beginning when we were talking about problems with the book, talking about how it worked. Now talking about how structurally there's some things in the end that are a little vague and don't work as well.
It's a messy book. Again, I don't think it's the best version of what it wants to be. It reminded me in a lot of ways of Ancillary Justice, which was another like sci-fi book where that was another book where we had issues with like how much you can relate to the characters and how much of the world building is actually told to you. But the thing about it is that book had such a strong last third that like it was able to rally and get all that stuff to work. And that's the thing with books, is often you can tell whether they're going to be good or bad within like a couple of chapters, but sometimes books rally. And like the emotionality of some of those scenes by the end really in Ancillary Justice really made me remember that book more fondly than my majority of my reading experience with it. And you said the same thing.
Yeah. 100%.
This book never quite rallies to have those heights. You never really quite have like Like I always remember the two ship AI having a conversation while she's waiting to
Oh,
die. That's a good part. The part with her
oh.
butler, like, and her finally bonding, that's a really nice moment too. And again, the world building is also sort of vague, but then also the thing is, I think the actual prose are better in that. That's another thing, is that I don't think Lee has very good prose. I think they're like okay, but they're not like Annihilation, and they're not even like Ancillary Justice.
There was
They
a couple of descriptions I really liked. The moments that he chose to describe stuff in detail, he used a lot of really cool metaphors and comparisons.
That's true. There's a description of someone's face that I thought was really nice. The one like General Cowboy.
There's this one part where he describes the carnage as a book of profanities dumped out onto the field, but like a profanities of human bodies dumped out onto the field. And that's a great visceral image, but it's also not going into this huge, like that particular phrase isn't going into descriptions of the gore, but you get enough of it, like profanities of bodies.
There was a math simile or something like that towards the end of the book that I was like, oh, that was really, I don't remember what it is, but I just remember going, oh, that was really clever. I would have liked more of the book to be like that.
So Pearl, just because I have to do this, Pearl says, oh my god, I cannot believe Ninefox and Ancillary Justice are brought up together yet again, but nobody has mentioned damn gloves. There's a thing in Ancillary Justice where the Empire and Ancillary Justice, you never see people's hand. They are always gloved. And in this Empire as well, you are gloved all the time. It is considered very revealing and weird to unglove your hands. So Angry Otter says, yeah, it's a mess, but I loved it enough to keep going, and I was rewarded because the books get better.
I would not read the sequel, but I would be curious to read some of his short stories, because I'm curious to see if this is just an example of an author not like it. Sometimes short story writers can't become big book writers, like there's just the skill sets are different, or he picked a bad idea and then he had to make it into a whole book versus just being a short story. So I would be curious to pick up some of the short stories. Again, I didn't get a good like a sense that he was a particularly good writer from this, but it's always interesting to see what other people you're not really interested in reading the sequel, right?
I'm interested in reading the sequel in the sense that I want to see if the issues that I have, like if some of the questions I have get answered, or if some of the emotionality, because people said that as Karis gets away from the Empire and Jadao, she's able to develop a bit more as a character. And I would be interested purely, not out of actual interest, in and like from the critique point of view, I would read the sequels.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
But not because I like we finished Raven Boys and I was like, I want more of Ronin and Chainsaw. I'm gonna read that book. You know, like I was like,
that's Left-Handed Booksellers of London. You were also like, oh, this was pleasant. I'll read more of this.
Yeah. And so that was me personally being like, yes, I would like to read that personally. And where this, I'm like, no, I have to, like, there's something I want to wrap my mind around and get a better sense of in critiquing this book that I think by reading the whole series, I would get a better idea of were my issues in this book fixed, or on a fundamental level, this series is just not for me, and that I would be interested in discovering.
No, I think that's interesting. I don't care enough to read a whole book. Like, again, 6 hours is a big commitment for me in terms of time. So, but it's funny because I am like that with other, especially that's one of the reasons we do the critique streams, which are exclusive, by the way, to our Patreon. Also, if you want more exclusive content, pressure Maria into doing sequel live streams where she just kind of chats about the book instead of doing real analysis. She is very busy though, so those will be exclusive to one of the Patreon tiers, and you all in the comments of this video need to pressure her into doing it.
I think this book, while a lot of our readers are saying it worked for them, I think there are ways it could have been better. Like having, now I say that, but some of our patrons have literally said having a more emotional connection to Karis might have been a detriment to them, or that stopping and explaining might have taken away an element that they liked. Fair. But there's a couple of other things like the structure, the descriptions, it's a bit of a blank world, could have been better. And that some of a bit more explanation to world building could have really solidified your experience in it. And I think that's the important part, that like, we cultivate
good discussions. And it's going to be interesting to see how things grow, because right now we have a good amount of people for a live stream, but if we ever get to be like one of those channels that has like the chat is constantly going by like this on, like you do for Twitch or something, that's going to bring up new challenges in terms of mediating a discussion with our patrons and stuff. So and yeah, again, Maria's thinking of doing some sequel series. Me and Katie are going to be trying to do more critique streams. Me and her want to do like one extra a month. I will probably do a Will's A Song of Ice and Fire hour once a month. I'm going to try. I think I want to do that. It would be less prose focused than the one I did for the main channel, but I do just kind of want to talk about it. And I do have a book podcast, so I might as well, any last thoughts?
Read the book yourself, see how you feel about it. Like I said, a lot of people like it, and a lot of people are mid to not thrilled with it, as I think happens with any book. See how you feel about it individually. If you love this book, don't let us take your joy from you. If you didn't, don't use us to justify to your friend that you like why they were wrong. Just vibe.
As always, we love you, our parasocial darlings. Sign us out, Maria.
Bye.